On February 16, 1998, China Airlines Flight 676 is in trouble. The pilots are fighting to correct a late descent, but the plane is dangerously high and off the glide path. Rain lashes the cockpit windows, and visibility is rapidly deteriorating. The situation grows worse with each passing moment, as errors and miscommunication take hold. Inside the cockpit, alarms sound and the crew struggles to stabilize the aircraft. Confusion and hesitation create a perfect storm of failure, with the ground rushing closer. The lives of 203 people now hang in the balance. Can the crew regain control, or will this flight end in tragedy? Let's find out. This is the story of China Airlines Flight 676. On February 16, 1998, Captain Kang Long Lin and First Officer Zhang Desheng suited up to fly China Airlines Flight 676, a regularly scheduled service from Denpasar on the Indonesian resort island of Bali back to Taipei, Taiwan's capital city. The plane they would be flying was an Airbus A300, the first model Airbus ever produced, and the world's first twin-engine wide-body jet. Although this particular plane was only 8 years old, by 1998 the A300 was not particularly technologically advanced. It predated Airbus's introduction of fly-by-wire technology and flight envelope protections. So in most respects it flew just like conventional jets by Boeing and McDonnell Douglas. Captain Kang had been flying the A300 for several years, accumulating over 2,300 hours on the type, a significant contrast to First Officer Zhang, who was not inexperienced but had only recently transitioned to the A300 and had just 304 hours on the new airplane. With 182 passengers and 14 crew on board, China Airlines Flight 676 departed Bali at 3:27 p.m., headed north toward Taiwan. But by the time Flight 676 drew near to the island, several hours later, night had fallen and bad weather was rolling over Taipei's Chiang Kai-shek International Airport. Fog reduced visibility to 1,300 meters with a broken ceiling just 100 feet above the ground. Nearby, thunderstorms dumped rain over the city and lightning flashed between the clouds. The pilots tuned in to the airport's Automated Terminal Information Service, or ATIS, to receive the details. Visibility was bad and trending downward. If they didn't land soon, conditions could fall below the minimums, forcing a diversion. Kang was determined to get his passengers on the ground in Taipei, but his eagerness would set off a chain reaction of errors that no one could stop. At 7:35 p.m., First Officer Zhang informed the crew they would begin their descent in 7 minutes. But minutes ticked by and no descent clearance was requested. Kang, focused elsewhere, didn't give the order to call air traffic control until 7:45, 3 critical minutes after they should have started their descent. Now, with precious time lost, they'd need to drop thousands of feet faster than planned, squeezing the descent into a shorter distance. The pressure in the cockpit began to mount. As they descended through 25,000 feet, Zhang focused on preparing for the expedited descent, while Kang issued instructions that grew increasingly hurried. "Contact operations for our gate assignment," Kang instructed. His voice clipped. Zhang reached for the radio, but just as he began to make the call, Kang interrupted, changing his mind. "No, forget that. Focus on the descent." Zhang hesitated, then proceeded with the call anyway, but in his rush, he forgot to switch the radio frequency. "Operations, Dynasty 676, Zhang said clearly, broadcasting not to China Airlines Operations Center, but over the general air traffic control frequency for everyone to hear. An awkward silence hung in the air for a moment. Before Captain Kang grabbed the radio, his tone sharp. "Disregard that transmission," he said curtly, covering the mistake. Zhang, flustered, switched to the correct frequency and made the call. But the damage was done. The error had embarrassed him in front of his captain, the controller, and everyone else on approach to Taipei that evening. The tension in the cockpit was palpable now. What had begun as a slight delay in requesting descent clearance was snowballing into a series of missteps. As the descent continued, Captain Kang grew more impatient. He frequently ordered First Officer Zhang to contact air traffic control for new descent clearances as soon as possible. "We need to keep descending," Don't waste time writing things down, Kang insisted as the plane approached 25,000 feet. Zhang quickly followed his instructions and contacted air traffic control, which granted clearance to descend to 21,000 feet. Kang then said, "This is the most important thing. If we don't descend now, the visibility will get worse. Hurry up." His frustration with Zhang's pace was clear. Zhang hesitantly replied, "Key in this data?" trying to confirm his next action. "Key in? Just write it down and move on. We need to land as soon as possible. Later, we might not be able to descend. What is the QNH?" he demanded, referring to the barometric pressure needed for landing calculations. Despite Kang's urgency, his actions did not match his words. Because they had started descending 3 minutes late, the plane was now well above its optimal descent path. To get back on track, Kang needed to increase the rate of descent by pulling back the throttle and fully deploying the speed brakes. However, he only used the speed brakes briefly, about a minute before retracting them. This was far too short to make up for the lost time and altitude. At the same time, Kang repeatedly violated standard procedures by speaking directly to air traffic control whenever he felt Zhang was too slow. As the captain and pilot flying, Kang's role was to focus on operating the plane, while Zhang, as the first officer, was responsible for managing radio communications. But Kang's lack of trust in Zhang was clear, and he frequently took over tasks that should not have been his responsibility. At 7:57, as the pilots began the approach checklist, the controller cleared them to descend to 4,000 feet. But amid the escalating workload, neither pilot heard the transmission. And after finishing the approach checklist, they were supposed to cross-check their altitude and their distance from the airport, but neither pilot did this. According to the operations manual, they should have been at about 8,000 feet by this point, but they were actually at 10,000. Despite this, Captain Kang allowed their descent rate to go from minus 1,500 feet per minute to minus 800 feet per minute over the next 90 seconds, further exacerbating the problem. At 8 o'clock, First Officer Zhang said, "Only 16 miles to the runway. Currently the altitude is 7,000 feet. Probably in an attempt to get Captain Kang to realize that they were way too high. By this point, they should have been at 4,000 feet. But despite being aware of their excessive height, Kang merely told Zhang to extend the flaps early, in a futile attempt to increase drag and improve their descent rate. Recognizing that this would be insufficient, Zhang also extended the speed brakes without having been told to do so. Both of these measures were in fact totally inadequate. By this point, the only way to safely get down to the runway would have been to make a loop and rejoin the pattern at a lower altitude. Nevertheless, Captain Kang pressed on, extending the landing gear early to try to increase their descent rate even more. Noticing that Flight 676 was clearly too high, the approach controller asked, "Dynasty 676, is it too high for you?" But there was no reply, because he didn't manage to get the transmission in before the crew switched frequency to contact the tower. On board the plane, the reality of their situation finally dawned on Captain Kang. "Oh, we are high," he remarked, acknowledging the altitude discrepancy for the first time. But instead of initiating a go-around, he brushed off the problem, saying, "Go down further, it doesn't matter." Attempting to assess the situation, Kang began making distance calculations aloud, muttering that they probably couldn't make the approach safely. Despite this realization, he made no effort to abandon the landing attempt. His determination to reach the runway before weather conditions deteriorated seemed to override his judgment. As they passed over the outer marker, marking the start of the final approach, the plane was still at 3,000 feet, more than double the required 1,400 feet. The aircraft was far above the glide slope, but Kang misattributed their difficulties, saying, "God, tailwind is too strong." In reality, the light tailwind they were experiencing was not the issue. Their delayed descent and poor altitude management were to blame. 2 miles, Kang said abruptly, turning to Zhang. "Did you report? Report again." When Zhang hesitated to respond, Kang raised his voice in frustration. "Report! Report to the control tower," he yelled, further escalating the tension in the cockpit. Zhang hastily contacted the tower, reporting that there were 3 nautical miles, 5.5 kilometers, from the runway, correcting Captain Kang's earlier claim of 2 miles. Despite being aware of their position, Zhang still did not advise Kang that reaching the runway was likely impossible. At this point, Flight 676 had yet to pick up the glide slope signal, the system designed to guide the plane at the correct angle to the runway. This was because they were flying far above the glide slope's proper path. Then, something unexpected occurred. The flight director and autopilot, which had been indicating that they were above the glide slope, suddenly began indicating that they were below it. What happened was the aircraft had crossed into a false glide slope, located 6 degrees above the real one. Glide slope transmitters emit a primary beam at the correct 3-degree approach angle, but interference patterns create duplicate false lobes at higher angles, such as 6, 9 or 15 degrees. The 9-degree false glide slope, where the plane now was, uses reverse polarity, which causes the instruments to issue incorrect commands. Instead of directing a descent, the autopilot interpreted the signal as a need to climb. It adjusted the horizontal stabilizer for a nose-up position, exacerbating the plane's already unstable approach. Captain Kang knew that they were above the real glide slope, not below, so he pushed the nose down using the control column to prevent the plane from leveling off. Meanwhile, the autopilot was moving the horizontal stabilizer towards a nose-up position, creating a conflict. Kang was using the elevators to push the nose down, while the autopilot tried to pitch it up. At this point, the autopilot was in glide slope capture mode. In this mode, pilots can use the control column to manually adjust the plane's trajectory and intercept the glide slope more quickly. However, once the autopilot switches to glide slope track mode, activated when the plane nears the glide slope, manual control inputs are disabled unless the autopilot is forcibly disconnected. As the plane approached the false glide slope at 15 degrees, the autopilot switched to glide slope track mode. Because Kang was already applying significant force to the control column, the autopilot immediately disconnected, triggering a loud warning alarm. The plane was now in manual control. Initially, Captain Kang appeared unaware of the situation. He completed a checklist and called landing checklist complete, signaling his intent to continue the approach. But just 1 second later, he changed his mind. Realizing they were far too high, he announced, "Go around," and pressed the go-around switches. Normally, these switches activate the autopilot's go-around mode, which maintains a stable climb at or below an 18-degree pitch. However, since the autopilot had disconnected 6 seconds earlier, the switches only affected the auto-throttle, increasing engine thrust to go-around power. With the autopilot off, it was now Kang's responsibility to follow the flight director's guidance and manually control the plane. Instead, he became entangled in a confusing exchange with First Officer Zhang. "Go lever, go around?" Zhang asked, sounding unsure. Kang responded, "Positive rate, gear up." This was incorrect procedure. During a go-around, flaps must be retracted before the landing gear. Zhang hesitated, asking, "Gear down?" Kang insisted, "Gear up." And Zhang complied, retracting the landing gear. For 11 critical seconds, neither pilot controlled the plane. The increasing engine thrust caused the nose to pitch up rapidly, reaching a dangerous 30 degrees. Kang finally attempted to push the nose down, but his inputs were too weak to prevent the pitch from increasing further. The plane reached an extreme pitch angle of 42.5 degrees and its speed dropped below 100 knots. The stick shaker stall warning activated as the plane's wings began to lose lift. It banked 50 degrees to the right, then rolled 79 degrees to the left and entered a dive. Kang applied the stall recovery procedure, pitching the nose down to regain airspeed, but the plane was quickly losing altitude. In a panic, First Officer Zhang keyed his mic and said to air traffic control, 676 Tower Dynasty, Dynasty 676, confirm go around? Asked the tower. There was no reply. Inside the cockpit, warnings blared as the plane plunged toward the ground. Terrain, said the ground proximity warning system. Pull up, pull up. Captain Kang attempted to re-engage the autopilot, but in such an unusual attitude, this was impossible. The plane began to pull out of the dive, but it was clear they weren't going to make it. Pull up, altitude low, shouted First Officer Zhang. Pull up, said the ground proximity warning system. These were the last words in the cockpit voice recording. At 8:05 p.m. and 57 seconds, China Airlines Flight 676 crashed just outside the airport perimeter. The plane struck a field, skidded across a busy 4-lane road, and plowed into a row of 2-story townhouses. A massive explosion ripped through the neighborhood as flaming wreckage rained down, leveling 4 buildings and severely damaging several others. Homes lay in rubble, burning debris was scattered everywhere, and bodies were strewn across the area. Rescue teams arrived quickly, but the scene was grim. Despite early reports of a child passenger found alive, they succumbed to their injuries. All 196 passengers and crew on the plane were killed, along with 7 people on the ground. Emergency workers managed to save a few survivors from the collapsed buildings, including a baby pulled from the rubble 20 minutes after the crash. But for the most part, the ambulances went home empty. Contributing to the crash was poor crew resource management. Captain Kang's condescending behavior left First Officer Zhang hesitant to challenge him, despite recognizing the severity of their situation. Zhang's attempts to signal issues like noting their altitude or deploying speed brakes were indirect, and Kang dismissed any input. A more cooperative crew might have identified their excessive height earlier, planned for a go-around, and prevented the disaster. Thank you for watching. Hit that subscribe button to support us.